I recently asked the hashtag chess Discord members to submit their games that they'd lost or struggled to convert so that I could answer their questions about what they could have done better so that they and you can learn from their games. This week's game was an over-the-board game submitted by I Has a Carrot, and the question essentially boils down to how you should decide to trade down material. Or, in simple English, how and when you should give up a higher value piece for a lower value piece. After some tactics and great play, we reached this position. You can see quickly that white is a bishop and a pawn up, but white is not entirely out of the woods. This is not a completely won game. Before we talk about the position, let me show you how quickly things went south from here. After a couple of moves, the white king starts to be being chased around a little bit. The knight is really causing a lot of problems. It was round about here that I Has a Carrot was deciding should he give up the rook on g1 for the knight on g4, and decided not to because it seems really silly to trade off your higher valued rook for the lower valued knight. But you'll see after a couple of moves, the knight ends up contributing to a really brutal mate. So let's rewind to the position that we started in. I Has a Carrot mentioned that one of the thoughts over here was to try and trade a pair of rooks. And that's a really good idea. Usually when you are trying to win an endgame and you have two rooks still on the board, you try and trade off one pair of rooks because it limits your opponent's counterplay. In this game, it was a pretty good example of that both of the rooks were contributing to the checkmate. So if you take away one of those rooks, you're not going to get mated. Unfortunately, in this position, there doesn't seem to be any simple way to trade rooks. You can't force a rook trade. Rook h1 just blunders a rook. Rook to f2, they can just check you or move the rook away. So we go and see what sort of other ideas we have in this position. If you want, you can pause the video now to try and figure out how you would play this position yourself. Since there's no clear way to force a trade of rooks, what you can look at is there are two other things that you might want to do over here. Your rook on a1 is really inactive at the moment, and your king as well is completely cut off by the black rook. So two things you can try and do is get your a1 rook into the game, get your king a little bit more active, and then you start to trade pieces, win a pawn or two, promote some of your pawns, and you've got an easy full point. If you keep these two things in mind, trying to get your king a little bit more active and your rook on a1, you can end up finding good moves fairly simply in this position. Something like knight e2, for example, so your king can go to d2, and then your rooks are also connected, so it's a dual purpose move. That is one of the moves that is suggested by the engine as one of the top moves. Another move is something like a4, with the idea that if they push the pawn, you go back, and once again you can get your king a little bit more active, you can connect your rooks, and you also avoid your opponent going a4. We'll see in a moment why that's a problem. And if they take over here, then after rook takes a4, you've now solved one of those problems I mentioned earlier. Your rook is a lot more active. If we look at the move that was played in the game, which was rook to g1, it does stop the knight temporarily from getting into the position, but it doesn't look at any of the other two things that I mentioned, so it doesn't work on trading a rook or getting your king or your a1 rook a little bit more active. In fact, the position can go south really quickly without you even getting checkmated, because now black can play a4, and if you try to hang on to your extra material, the engine actually says that the best move is either bishop to f7 or looking at something like knight takes a4. But if you go bishop to a2 to try and hang on to the extra material, you could end up getting a horrible position, and after rook to b1 to defend this pawn, and rook h to h2, the engine actually evaluates black as being a lot better in this position. Because there's so much extra activity, your pieces are all tied up, your king is cut off as well, and probably black can win back some material in a couple of moves' time. If we now fast forward to the point where one can consider giving up the rook for the knight, which is at this place over here, if you check with an engine, you're going to find out that giving up the rook for the knight is not the most accurate move, and you can carry on hanging on to the extra material as long as you just make sure that you're not getting checkmated, so you don't have this mating pattern that we saw a little bit earlier. Having said that though, you might start to feel like a little bit uncomfortable over here with the knight busy threatening potentially some checkmating patterns. This rook's going to swing in, this pawn is causing you a lot of chaos, so probably here, even though you're up material, you're probably thinking, am I going to be fine here? Am I going to get checkmated? So if we look at things from a practical perspective, it could make a lot of sense to actually give up the rook for the knight, even if it lessens our advantage a little bit. It's relieving the pressure, and if we do a material count, so after rook takes, pawn takes, and king takes, we are still up material, strictly speaking. So we've got a knight and a bishop for a rook, and we've each got a rook, and then we have an extra two pawns as well. We'll probably drop a pawn after something like this, because then our bishop has to move and they get to take our c2 pawn. But still, having said that, the two pieces should be an advantage. We should be able to pick up a pawn or two, maybe trade off one of the pairs of rooks, and end up getting a winning endgame. So we can think of rook takes g4 as a simplifying move. It's trying to make a position where you still think that you have an advantage, but you're giving back a little bit of material just to make sure that you don't get checkmated. You do have to still check though after rook takes g4 that you still think this position is winning, but fortunately you do have this pawn to hide behind, and there's no perpetual check or anything like that because the king should be able to escape. You've also got quite a strong passed pawn. So taking the knight with rook takes g4 could be seen as a form of simplifying the position. You're giving back some of the material you have, and you often do this in an endgame or maybe a middle game where you're being attacked and you want to just limit your opponent's counterplay and make sure you don't get checkmated during the game. Another example of simplifying a position where you might want to trade down material is, let's say you're playing a queen and pawn versus a rook and pawn and you have this position on the board. You know that if the queen and the rook were gone from the board, you'd just have a completely winning endgame because you have 3 pawns and you should be able to promote at least one of those to get another queen. Even if the engine tells you that it's not the best move when you look at the game afterwards, it could be the best move for you and the most practical chances to just trade off the queen for the rook, and then you make sure that you can't blunder your queen at all. And if you think that it's unlikely that you'll blunder your queen, it could happen in time travel perhaps, maybe you just have a mind slip, it definitely does happen every now and again. Speaking from personal experience, of course. Just make sure that you are trading down into a position that you evaluate as winning. Let's say you're in the middle game and you're a bishop up, probably it's not a good idea to give up the queen for the rook, because you're going to be trading down into a probably losing position. Here we can clearly see that this position is winning after we trade it off, but if you can't see a clear route forward, then rather hang on to the extra material and try wait for an opportunity where you are definitely going to have a winning endgame or winning position once you trade down your material. The key takeaway from this video is that you don't need to be afraid to give back material if you're in a very uncomfortable position after winning material. Remember that when you checkmated, no one goes and checks the board to see if you are up material just before the game ends. Through practice, you'll get better at making sure you're winning the position after you trade down, and you'll also be able to be more confident in your trades. Thank you very much to I Has a Carrot for submitting the game, and if you want to submit a game yourself, just make sure to hop into the Discord and check out the announcements channel. And if you want to make sure that bad maths isn't affecting your evaluation skills, why not check out this video over here. Thanks for watching and happy chessing!